Where I live around this time of year, I get very sick from pollen for a couple weeks, so I was very sick sounding when I first recorded this. But we were talking about the James Bond video games and the unfortunate state of them in the modern day, and I will sound very sick, but let's hop right into it. Growing up, the James Bond video game series always fascinated me. It was one of those game series that it felt so creative. There was always gadgets, there was always hot girls, there was always Bond at the center of it all, either gunning down some villain or finding some subterfuge-like way to get around a problem. It was very creative and enjoyable to me, and there was almost an era of golden 007 games where even when they weren't great, they were still fun. These games would tie into movies, sometimes they would fill in the gaps between them, sometimes they would be adaptations of these movies that very obviously were their own thing since those events did not happen in the film. The sky was the limit when it came to Bond, with even weird, bad spin-offs like the GoldenEye Rogue Agent game. Now, the point of this video is to kind of take a look at the frustrating and sad current state of James Bond video games, because as it stands, there has not been a new Bond game in quite a while since 007 Legends, other than a small game on the Apple Arcade, which is Cypher 007, which, no hate to that, is a totally different type of experience. James Bond used to be a mainstay when it came to console gaming. This was a character that was larger than life, that was always ready to tackle another problem, regardless of what version of the character it was, and to see him kind of fallen on hard times where there's very little games coming out other than an announced game in the works from IO Interactive, it's just kind of sad. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content going forward. I appreciate you very much. I do want to do some more James Bond videos, and I actually have a playlist on this channel of Bond videos as well. And that leads me to today's question of the day. What is your favorite James Bond video game and why? What do you like about it? I love to hear that down in the comments down below. Lets me get to know you a little bit more and also helps me to find some new games to play. If I had to pick a current definitive video game James Bond, it would have to be Pierce Brosnan. Pierce Brosnan is one of my favorite actors in general, but also one of my favorite to ever play James Bond. I actually reviewed all of his Bond movies on this channel, from GoldenEye all the way to Die Another Day, and regardless of when the script was frustrating or when things didn't go the way that I thought they should, Brosnan was always a shining light in the film. And Brosnan was also the Bond who has gotten the most video games, I would say, or at least modern games. There are definitely a lot of James Bond games inspired by older actors that are a little more inaccessible at this point without emulation or very old hardware, but when it comes down to it, from the era of the PlayStation 1 all the way up through the end of the PS2 and the GameCube and the Xbox, the main James Bond we were seeing games from was Pierce Brosnan. They could be games like The World Is Not Enough, the famous GoldenEye 007, Everything or Nothing, but also there were many little hidden gems in there that were unique Bond adventures that could tie into the films if you wanted them to and fill in some gaps, but did not necessarily need to. These games were extremely creative, they really prioritized gadgetry, and they actually tried out different forms of gameplay. Some of them I don't like that much, like Tomorrow Never Dies. I think despite being a great movie, I find it to be a pretty bad third-person shooter, but you know, maybe my mind will change on that when I play it again. But even when there were clunkers, they were still enjoyable, and it was a fun era of Bond where they were trying new things and actually trying to stick to the vibes of the films of that era. That all changed a little bit when EA actually lost the license to Bond. You have to remember this was back when EA was actually trying with their games, and the license ended up in the hands of Activision. Now, Activision is probably most popular and known in modern days for Call of Duty, But Activision also did make a lot of experimental and fun games. They published quite a bit back in the day, including a lot of superhero games, some of which were good and some bad, but my point is Activision was actually trying new things as well. Unfortunately, by the time that they obtained Bond, Activision was very, very grounded in Call of Duty. That was pretty much their bread and butter. That was what they knew how to make. There are certainly development teams that were involved with Activision Bond games that did try to go their own way and do different things. For example, the team that actually worked on the PlayStation 2 port of Quantum of Solace really tried to make it feel more like an everything or nothing style game. But a lot of these Bond games in the Activision era ended up being very much inspired by Call of Duty. It didn't help that the Craig era of Bond was not necessarily known for its gadgetry, at least up until Skyfall. They were mainly trying to focus on a Bond that wasn't using outlandish gadgets to get out of trouble, but I really think that that made some of those movies lose a little bit of the charm that previous films had had, and it pushed that loss of charm actually off onto the games as well. Now, I love the Craig era of Bond, but I personally prefer it in Skyfall and beyond when he actually starts using some gadgets and really cool weaponry and other things that aren't necessarily super grounded in realism. Games like GoldenEye Reloaded did try to capture some of the feeling and fun of the previous James Bond eras and incorporate Daniel Craig's Bond into that style as well, that he would later end up embracing, especially in movies like No Time to Die. But I do think that the damage was kind of already done on Bond, where people were starting to see more and more similarities with COD and fewer with the James Bond games that they grew up with. It all unfortunately came to a head in 2012 with 007 Legends, which is regarded as one of the worst James Bond games ever made, and the game that completely killed the franchise when it came to video games, up until the announcement of IO Interactive working on a Bond game, and of course as well Cypher 007 launching on the Apple Arcade. Which again, there's no shade to that game. I actually think it's a very creative and fun game, but it's not really trying to capture that big budget, huge console gaming Bond campaign feel or story mode that previous games had captured. It's going for something totally different, and it does it. It nails it. That said, the current state of James Bond games is just kind of sad because of all of this that happened. Not only are these games not really preserved in any meaningful way other than ROMs and discs, like I said before, they're never really HD remastered, they're never brought up for the most part, except for the rare exception of the original GoldenEye recently being brought to Xbox and Switch platforms. Those games, a lot of them, the old James Bond games, prior to the Xbox 360 generation, are becoming harder and harder for people to access without using emulation on PC, and that's a shame. And that's happened with a lot of licensed games, from Spider-Man all the way to Bond. It's just something that unfortunately happens when you have a huge license that gets a game, is that it often gets left behind because people don't want to pay for music licensing, they don't want to pay that actor for their likeness again, they don't want to pay those developers again, they don't want to go through the pain of remastering or remaking something, so they just ditch it. And I made an entire video on that subject specifically before, but all of that has sort of culminated into just a sad, tired state for the Bond franchise where the video games aren't really even thought of anymore by most people. They're seen as a relic of the past. I think the thing that makes me most sad about this is the fact that even when we do get another Bond game, it's not going to be the same. I do believe it will be a good game. I do believe IO Interactive is fantastic. But I do also believe that Activision, and even EA a little bit beforehand with some of their film tie-ins, really squandered the Bond license and diluted it to the point where it eventually died when it came to gaming. And I don't understand how you managed to make a colossal mess up that big. How do you take a series worth billions of dollars in films and just screw it up when it comes to video games, especially when the creativity of who James Bond is and what he is, it lends itself so much to gaming. With the announcement of a new Bond actor actually imminent, it's also a little sad to know that that actor likely will never get their own games. I mean, we've moved away from the movie tie-in games, and the more original James Bond games are now going to feature a new video game Bond created by IO Interactive, which again I hope is great, but it's a bit of a nostalgia killer for me because I look back at these eras of games with Pierce Brosnan or Daniel Craig, or even games like From Russia with Love with Sean Connery, and it's sad because, you know, it's like you're not going to be playing those movie characters anymore. You're going to be playing a whole new Bond. It's both exciting and awesome, but also frustrating at the same time because it's been radio silence on that project for quite a while when I do record this. Between the fact that this game series was killed off essentially by Activision trying to turn it into COD, and also the fact that it's been radio silence for multiple years now on Project 007, it's just frustrating because the games as they existed, like I covered in a previous video, they're not even preserved very well. There are ROMs out there, there are discs, but there aren't really remasters. Nobody really brings these games back or ports them. I'm sure they are a licensed nightmare when it comes to actors' faces, music, all of this stuff that licensed games suffer from. But unfortunately, that means in a lot of ways, for many people, they're just not easily accessible games. So it's not even something where you can just be fine with what we got, because many people no longer really have technology that can play those things. It's sad. I love these games, and I really do think that they deserve better, and I hope that in the future we look back on this and it's all just a big nothing burger and that it's all fixed, but it's been a problem for years and it doesn't really seem like it's going anywhere. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content. Let me know in the comments down below what you're thinking, what your favorite Bond game is. All that stuff is awesome to hear about. Of course, there are ways to support this channel. We do have other channels like Degenerate Plays. We have channels like Magical Jill where we cover anime. We have channels like JayRPG where we go through RPG games. And we do also have our own store, CosmoBunny.shop, where of course you can get 10% off your first order by using code DJAY123. So plenty of ways to support this channel. We appreciate you very much. Have a fantastic day. And as always, everyone, stay shway.